My name's Linda Helm, and I teach at the Ohio State University College of Social Work. I teach an ethics class, and so I thought it would be helpful if we came down here to the National Association of Social Workers Ohio chapter and talked with the executive director, Danielle Smith, about the Code of Ethics for social workers. NASW is a professional organization representing social workers nationally. Each state has their own chapter, and NASW's Ohio chapter is here in Columbus at 33 North 3rd Street. So we're going to go up and talk to Danielle Smith, the executive director, about NASW. And let me tell you a couple things about NASW before we go up. As I said, they're the professional organization for social workers. They provide advocacy, they lobby and work with our representatives over at the State House to ensure that legislation provides us with title protection and other employment protections. They also advocate for necessary policies that will be helpful to the clients that we serve. They provide information and education on all of the professional areas within which we work, aging, child welfare, and make policy statements on those topics. They provide professional development, continuing education workshops. As you know, social workers must be licensed, and we're required to have 30 continuing education credits for every 2 years in order to renew our license. And so NASW does a good job making sure that we have those available to us. They also provide other kinds of resources. We can purchase our malpractice insurance through NASW. Anyway, let's go up and talk to Danielle Smith and see what else she can tell us about NASW. And one of the most important things we want to talk with Danielle Smith about today is the Code of Ethics that guides us as social workers in our behavior with our clients.
So the first value is service, and that's really our commitment to clients, to go above and beyond what they need to make sure that their needs are met. It's not necessarily doing everything that they ask or sacrificing your own well-being for your client's well-being, but it's doing what you know is right. For example, there's a social worker, Frank Webb, who was recently inducted into the Social Work Pioneer Program through NASW, he had a client and the veteran passed away, and his wife really wanted him to be buried in his uniform, but his uniform was in Kentucky, and there really wasn't a way for the family to get it. And so Frank, who is a social worker, took it upon himself to drive all the way to Kentucky to get that uniform for his wife. And I think that demonstrates the value of service, to do what's right, even though it's sometimes inconvenient. The second value is dignity and worth of the person. And that's really why I became a social worker, because we know that all people inherently have dignity and worth. And regardless of some of the decisions they make that you might not agree with, that we know deep down that as a person we have to respect them for whom they are. The third value is social justice. And this is really what I work on every day, to make policy changes, to make large changes that make it easier for people to be happy and to live full lives. And so when we're working on social justice, that can be on the client level, on a one-to-one level, or it can be here what we're doing on a state level to make social justice change for all people. The fourth value is competence, and this is what you're learning now in school, to be a competent social worker. And that's very important to the profession, because it's not like we decided one day that we're going to just start helping people. We went to school, we went to a lot of school to learn the theory behind our practice, and that is essential to being a good ethical social worker. The next value is integrity, and that really is the ethical piece of it, to operate with integrity, to not just operate with good intentions, but to make sure that you're doing everything with integrity for yourself, for your clients, and for the profession. The last value is the importance of human relationships. And this is really what makes our profession strong, is the ability to connect to other people to achieve goals. Your ability as a social worker to network, to find information for clients, to do referrals, all comes down to this value. There is a social worker in Cleveland who told me that there was a student who stopped coming to school, and she was wondering why the student wasn't coming to school any longer. And it turned out that the girl had been kidnapped and was being sold into human trafficking, sex slavery. And because the social worker had a relationship with this student, she noticed that she hadn't been at school and took action, and the police department was able to find her before she was transported out of the state. So that value shows why we're an exceptional profession and why the importance of human relationships is so integral to our practice as social workers. So as social workers, we often are faced with decisions and situations that call for us to have good ethics. And whether you're a social worker on a one-to-one level with clients or you're doing more macro work, it's important to have strong ethics, to have strong critical thinking skills related to ethics, and to have some decision-making models that you can use when things get sticky. And even though I don't have clients in my work as Executive Director of NASW Ohio chapter, there are a lot of times where we have to use the ethical decision-making models we learned in our education, use the code of ethics and those models. One time that I can think of that happened recently is we do a lot of advocacy work, and so we're at meetings where we are trying to compromise, come up with a decision to move policy forward. And the most recent one was a bill that would create a license for art therapists. And it's difficult because I love what art therapists do. It's an important part of the helping professions in our state and country. And we want to protect the public to make sure that people who call themselves art therapists didn't just take a weekend class on it and are now, hanging up their shingle, taking in clients under that therapy. The problem with it, though, is there's a lot of confusion or unintended consequences to what could happen if we would start licensing other professionals and creating lots of different licenses within our own licensing board. And so this happens quite a bit where it seems pretty straightforward that we should support a policy, but we can't because of these other issues. And so when we were meeting with art therapists and some of the representatives for other professions, there's a tendency to just not agree, to close the meeting and say, well, I guess we're not going to agree, so we're going to just stop the legislation from going forward. But I think as social workers, and what I try to do is to really uphold that ethical principle of respect for colleagues and to hear out people and what they think, even if it differs from what I think. And so we always try to uphold that respect piece, to not talk badly about other people, to be very respectful and polite in meetings with people that we disagree with. And even though the art therapy is something that we have very slight differences on, sometimes we'll be in meetings where we absolutely disagree with someone. And it's still important to uphold that ethical principle of respect for our colleagues so that you can be a social worker with integrity. NASW is the Professional Association for Social Workers. So the way that we're funded is by members, social workers, paying dues to support our work. We do have a role in ethics violations in that we have our own process for NASW members. But then we also work closely with the Counselor, Social Worker, and Marriage and Family Therapist Board in their licensing violation process. So we are two separate entities. We are a professional association nonprofit, and the licensing board is a government department. So although we're different, we work together on different ethical issues and licensing issues as well. So I do find out a lot of information about what ethical violations social workers are committing and what the process is to resolve those. And because of that, I've seen some things that are, range from not that bad to pretty serious infractions against the social work rules. To me, the worst thing that you could possibly do as a social worker is abuse the authority or the power that you inherently have as a social worker over your clients. So even though we're a team with our clients, as an authoritative figure, you do have that power, and you have to be very careful that you don't cross that boundary line into having a dual relationship or something much more serious. So the number one ethical issue that the licensing board will tell you is that social workers and other helping professionals have sexual relationships with their clients. And I know that's shocking, and we're always shocked by it, but I would consider that to be not just a boundary issue or not just a dual relationship, but a severe abuse of that power that you have over your clients and the ability to manipulate or to abuse that power. And that obviously can range from something that's that serious to something that you don't think is a big problem. Like recently I heard of a social worker who had a client who did home repairs. And during their sessions, she found out that he was a great repairman and that his services were relatively inexpensive. And so then that social worker used her client, or had her client perform those repair services on her home house. And so even though you might not think that's a big problem, if you think about the abuse of your powers, your authority as a social worker with your client, there's a lot of problems with that. What if your client gives you a special deal? You just don't want to get into it. So always be considerate of that power and authority that you have as a social worker. And my advice to avoid that worst situation is to be honest and upfront and think through things critically. It's not enough to just think, oh, I had good intentions. Because I think that is probably one of the barriers to good ethical practice, is thinking you're doing the right thing without thinking critically about the unintended consequences. There are a lot of barriers to good ethical practice, including that issue, but I'd also say there's the time issue to critically think. Sometimes we're making decisions on the fly, and it's hard to sit down and think through exactly what you should do or what you shouldn't do. It's also easy for me to say in a macro setting of what you should do as a clinical social worker, but you have to spend some time thinking through these issues so that you don't end up in a situation that you didn't mean to get into. I would say a barrier is good intentions, actually. For example, we have had social workers call us who wanted to know if it's an ethical violation to give money to clients. And in terms of the client, desperately needs their heat bill paid so they can get their heat turned back on, and it's only $20, and I couldn't find anywhere else to provide me that money. So, hey, social worker, won't you give me that $20? And as a social worker, you just want to help someone. The value of service shows that we should go above and beyond. But when you give money to that one client, you're giving money in an unfair way, because are you going to then give money to every client who asks for it? So you have to think through these things, because the good intentions or that service value would say, just give them the money. But that is an ethical violation, so you have to be careful and think through those issues. But a barrier to that, like I said, is the time, and then also the caseloads that you might have. So many agencies are requiring their social workers to do more with less, and it diminishes the amount of time that you can spend thinking through the best ethical option. And so that's part of our role at NASW, is to resolve some of those barriers, like the caseloads, pay, safety issues, so that you can spend more time and therefore be a better social worker. So good client care as a social worker comes from being an ethical social worker. You can't have good client care without being an ethical social worker. If you look through the Code of Ethics, it lists things like informed consent policies, confidentiality, boundaries, dual interests, and that's the section for your responsibility to your clients. And then all the other sections also play into your good clinical care as well, because if you're not upholding the ethical responsibilities to your colleagues, to your agency, to your profession, to broader society, it's impossible for you to provide that good client care. The cornerstone of social work is the person and environment. And so if you're ignoring the last section of the code related to broader society and social justice, then it's more difficult, or you're not doing the best job you possibly could with your clients if you don't understand the environmental issues, the policy issues affecting their lives. And so without that code of ethics, without being a good ethical social worker, you cannot possibly provide good quality care to your clients. So at NASW, we're a little bit unique because we have the code of ethics that's produced by our organization that we obviously uphold to as staff members at NASW. I'm a licensed social worker, and the other staff member in our office is as well. And so we have to uphold to the code of ethics. But additionally, we try to uphold ourselves to the strictest standards of ethics, because for obvious reasons, I mean, if we were to commit an ethics violation, how much worse would that look from maybe another social worker, since we are responsible for the code of ethics and for ethics violations. So to me, as executive director, it's important that all of our staff, all of our volunteers uphold themselves to the strictest, most high-level ethics policies that they can. And so because of that, we have probably more ethical policies than a lot of other agencies, and we also detail them to specific aspects of our functioning. So we have a social media policy, because that's a big piece of what we do here to promote our profession and to get the word out about NASW. And so there's a little bit of mixing between our professional use of social media and our personal use. So you can definitely get into gray area with that if you don't have a social media policy. So we have that. We also have a book of how we are to engage ethically in politics, in giving to candidates, and all of the things that come with engaging in advocacy and policy. And that's because you can very quickly run into not only ethics violations, but violate the law if you are not careful on how you're doing your policy and candidate work. So we have those additional policies because of the unique situation that we're in. But again, we make sure that all of our volunteers, all of our staff really understand our code of ethics, the rules governing our licenses, so that we don't make a mistake that could negatively impact NASW. So maintaining confidentiality in documentation is just as important here in an administrative setting as it is in a clinical setting. And we have to make sure that we're following those things in our processes because we are responsible for a lot of things, including our ethical violation process. And since I know quite a few of our members of NASW, there are a lot of times where we receive a complaint against a member, and I know them, and I might know them very well. And so we have to maintain confidentiality and maintain those boundaries so that we're not getting involved or being a barrier to the ethical violation process. It's also important for our documentation piece because we are involved in a lot of advocacy work, in a continuing education piece, and so we have to keep documents, keep a list of what we've done that's just about as detailed as what you would do if you're working one-on-one with a client. And obviously we care very much about social workers maintaining good confidentiality and writing well in their documentation so that the practice of social work is protected. We want to make sure that social workers are doing the best job possible. So we want to make sure that social workers are upholding those ethical principles. And that's why we have the ethical violation process. It's not to punish our members or to make NASW members more at risk than a non-member. It's to help them. And so when we receive a complaint against a member, it's really to help them through the issue that brought them to that point, not to be punitive. And so for all those reasons, we want to make sure that social workers have the tools and knowledge to maintain confidentiality and to provide good documentation. So like I said, it is important that at NASW we maintain the highest ethical standards possible. And I personally believe that to be applicable to our staff and to our volunteers. So when I hear, which doesn't happen often, when I hear about our staff or volunteers doing something that I would consider to be an ethical violation, I will talk directly to that person. I know in agencies there's a lot of different policies or procedures in place for how you should report an ethical violation, but for us, I like to confront it head on and talk to that person directly to get as much information as they're willing to share so that I can be in the best position possible to decide whether I'm going to report or not. So if someone comes to me and says something, I'm more likely to report probably than someone else because I think it's important that we maintain those standards. That also runs into some problems, not so much with the people who work for NASW or are on our board, but when I hear other people talk about ethical violations. Sometimes people will call our office and ask for help on issues, and it will become clear to me that they have committed an ethics violation. And so what I will do is talk to that person about why I think it's an issue, and like I said earlier, I'll frame it in more of a let's help you than let's punish you. Because I obviously want all social workers to be able to practice, and it's not my goal to have social workers get in trouble through the licensing board, but I do want to offer our support through NASW, through the licensing board, to help them resolve that ethical issue and then make sure it doesn't happen again. So when I hear about something, I will talk to that person up front because I think it's important to be transparent and honest, and then I will do a complaint to the licensing board, or I'll do a complaint through our NASW process. So there are two processes, one for NASW members and then one through the licensing board. So as an NASW member, a complaint can be brought against you by anyone, by another colleague, by a client, and they can go through our process. And basically what happens is you fill out a form, our National Ethics Office will decide if it's a valid complaint, and then they will either mediate, adjudicate, or come up with an agreement. And the most severe punishment that could result from that is loss of your NASW membership. So there's not a lot that happens in that process that's very punitive. Like I said, it's more of let us give you the tools, the supervision, the tools that you need to be more ethical in your practice. The other process is through the licensing board, which is separate from us, but we do have that relationship between the two entities, between NASW and them. And with this process, you have to fill out the form, the application form that says what your complaint is. And again, this can come from a colleague or a client, so you could submit this against another social worker. They have to be licensed, and you fill out the form, and the board will investigate. So the board has a couple of investigators who will collect the information about the process, and they will go through their proceedings, which they'll talk to you about. But we have that relationship between the licensing board and us, which means that I usually report to both if I hear of an ethics violation. But again, I think the best procedure, regardless of where you work or what the policy might be there, is to be honest and upfront with the person you think is being or committing the ethical violation, and then to report to whomever is your supervisor. Since NASW produces the Code of Ethics, we also produce programming and services to help you uphold the Code of Ethics. So on a national level, NASW has a website, which is socialworkers.org, and you can click on the link that says ethics and find a lot of helpful information there, including decision-making models, and probably the most helpful piece is an ethics consultation line. So if you are an NASW member, you can call 2 days a week and speak to an ethics expert and an attorney who will help you work through these issues and figure out what the best procedure is to take. Then on a state level, we have resources as well. We do consultations on ethics issues out of our office, and we make referrals to NASW members who are trained as consultants to help if it's outside of our knowledge area. And we also have documents on our website, which is naswoh.org, that will help you if you need to work through an issue in supervision or need access to one of those decision-making models. And really, our role as NASW is here to support you. So please call us if you ever have an issue. We get calls like that pretty often, so it's not a burden to call us because we are your advocate and want to help you be an ethical social worker. So when you become a social worker or when you start your field practicum, you will probably immediately see these gray areas, ethical issues, and you will probably be worried or confused about what to do. And I certainly was when I started practicing as a social worker. And my best advice to you is to think through these issues ahead of time and think through what you would do before you get to that point. So if you're concerned about finding out that a coworker is committing an ethics violation and you're not sure what you should do, think through that issue ahead of time. Think of who you should talk to, ask your supervisor, ask your agency HR rep of who should do what, and so that if that issue comes up, you know what to do. I do a lot of work on ethics of social media, and my number one advice on that is create a social media policy for yourself. This is exactly how you will use social media for yourself and with your clients. Hopefully one that says you will not friend your clients. But when you have that social media policy, you can provide it to your clients on day one. So that way, further down the road, if they ask you, oh, why didn't you add me on Facebook, you can refer back to that policy. So think through what can protect you, what can protect your agency, what can protect your clients ahead of time. Write it up or think through it and have that so you can fall back onto it when the crisis occurs.